An ordinary afternoon stroll takes a sharp turn when an elderly woman tells a young Hispanic man to go back to Mexico. His response doesn't just leave the crowd speechless, it changes everything. It was a late spring afternoon in a suburban park in Northern California. The sun was beginning to lower, casting a warm golden light across the park's green lawns. Children laughed and screamed as they ran through the playground while joggers circled the path that snaked around the park. Parents leaned on benches, watching their little ones play some reading books, others chatting. The air was full of the sounds of laughter, the rustle of leaves in the trees, and the rhythmic tap of sneakers hitting the pavement. It was a familiar scene, a peaceful sunny day in a community where people from all walks of life gathered to unwind and enjoy the outdoors. It seemed like any other day until the atmosphere of the park changed with a single moment. Near the grove of oak trees, an elderly woman in her early 80s sat on a bench, slowly adjusting her wide-brimmed hat as she scanned the pages of a well-worn novel. Her clothing was simple gray slacks, a faded sweater, and a pair of old leather shoes, and her movements were slow and deliberate, a reflection of the many years she had lived. Though she appeared calm and composed, there was a hint of impatience in the way she flipped the pages of her book, as if her mind was racing ahead of her body. Nearby, a young Hispanic man, tall with dark curly hair and wearing a red t-shirt and cargo shorts, walked past with his dog, a German Shepherd mix, trotting alongside him. His name was Miguel. He was in his mid-20s, a man of few words but deep thoughts. He had just finished a long shift at the local auto shop and was trying to unwind with a peaceful walk in the park before heading home. As Miguel walked by, his dog pulled at the leash, eager to explore the grass nearby. He paused for a moment, glancing down at his phone to check for any missed messages. His steps were slow and measured, as though he was taking in the calm of the park, allowing his thoughts to drift as he gazed at the fading light of the day. He didn't notice the elderly woman at first, but as he came closer, he felt her eyes on him. It wasn't a casual glance. He could sense the shift in the air, like a subtle change in temperature. He looked up and saw the elderly woman staring at him with a hard expression on her face. She squinted as if assessing his every movement. He smiled politely and nodded in her direction, but she didn't return the gesture. Instead, her lips tightened as she put down her book, her attention fixed on him now. Miguel felt a strange unease wash over him as he continued walking, but he didn't think much of it until she spoke. "You people don't belong here," she muttered loud enough for those around them to hear. Miguel froze, his thumb hovering over his phone. For a second, he thought he might have misheard. He glanced up, confusion written across his face. His heart raced, but his calm demeanor didn't waver. He simply waited, unsure of what to say. The elderly woman looked directly at him now. Her eyes narrowed, her voice growing sharper. "Why don't you go back to Mexico where you came from?" The words struck like a sudden gust of wind. The world seemed to pause. A few people walking by stopped in their tracks, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Others, too afraid to get involved, pretended not to hear. But the stillness that followed was deafening. The atmosphere, once light and carefree, now felt tense, heavy with the weight of her words. Miguel's dog tugged slightly at the leash, sensing his owner's unease. For a moment, Miguel didn't know how to respond. The words were unexpected, vile, and cruel. He could feel the eyes of everyone around him, their gazes shifting back and forth between him and the elderly woman. Some people stopped walking, unsure of what to do. Others avoided looking directly at the scene, but the tension was palpable. It wasn't just Miguel and the woman anymore. It was the whole park holding its breath. Miguel's first instinct was to lash out, to say something back in anger. He felt his chest tighten, and for the briefest moment, his mind raced with responses. But instead of reacting immediately, he took a slow breath. His gaze never wavered from the woman's face, but he remained still, carefully weighing his response. His grip on the leash tightened, and his dog sat quietly beside him. The woman stood her ground, her face flushed with the heat of the confrontation, but there was a sense of expectation in her stance, as though she had anticipated this moment. Her chin was lifted, and her lips were pressed into a hard line. She wasn't apologetic. There was no remorse in her eyes. Her voice, when it came again, was sharp. "I said what I said," she snapped. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." Her words hung in the air, a challenge thrown down for anyone who might hear. A young couple walking by exchanged glances, their hands tightly entwined. The woman nearby, pushing a stroller, quickly turned her head as if she didn't want her child to overhear. The elderly man sitting on the bench, his wrinkled hands resting on his cane, watched with quiet concern. It was clear the moment had taken on a life of its own. Miguel didn't flinch. His face remained calm, his posture unwavering. He simply stood there for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle around them, letting the tension stretch between them like an invisible force. "All right," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Let's talk about that since you brought it up." The words seemed to cut through the silence like a knife, drawing the attention of the crowd. The woman's expression faltered slightly. She wasn't used to being challenged. Most people who had been on the receiving end of her words had either walked away or remained silent, but not Miguel. He didn't move closer. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, his eyes locked with hers, waiting. "You tell me I don't belong here," he continued, his voice steady, but full of quiet conviction. "Let me tell you something about where I come from." The elderly woman shifted slightly on the bench, her fingers gripping the edge of her purse. The people around them, curious, uneasy, shifted on their feet as well. The atmosphere felt charged with something heavier now. Miguel paused for a moment before continuing. "My great-grandfather was born in Mexico, and he came here to work the fields. He worked until his back ached, till his hands bled, so that his children could have a better life. His children, my grandparents, they built their lives here with nothing but sweat and perseverance. And my father fought in Vietnam. He risked his life for a country that didn't treat him as equal." Miguel's words were measured, each one carefully chosen. The woman's eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. He could feel her resistance, but it didn't faze him. "My father came back to a country that didn't want him, a country that didn't even want to acknowledge his service. He couldn't sit at the same counters as white soldiers. He couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why?" Miguel's voice gained strength, now his words carrying more weight with each sentence. "Because he believed in this country's promise. He believed in the idea that anyone, no matter their skin color, could build a life here. Even when this country didn't believe in him." A slight murmur rippled through the crowd. An older man on the bench leaned forward, clearly moved by Miguel's words. Miguel continued, his voice gaining momentum. "And my mother," he said, his voice softening, but no less firm. "She's a nurse. She's given her life to caring for others. My father's a mechanic, and he's the kind of man who would stop on the side of the road to help someone even if they were the ones who called him names. He taught me what it means to have pride in yourself, to hold your head high no matter what people say." Miguel stepped closer to the woman, but his movements were slow and deliberate. "So you tell me I don't belong here," he said, his eyes still locked with hers. "You tell me to go back to Mexico. Let me tell you something. I am as much a part of this country as you are. My family has paid the price for it, and we're not going anywhere." The woman's face flushed a deep red, but she remained silent, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her purse. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The crowd watched mesmerized as Miguel stood unwavering, his voice calm but unyielding. "I could have walked away," he said, turning to face the onlookers now. "But what good would that have done? Silence doesn't stop ignorance, it only lets it grow." The air seemed to change again, and for the first time the crowd began to stir. A man with a baseball cap stepped forward, his voice cutting through the quiet. "He's right," the man said, his voice shaking slightly. "We've got to do better than this." An older woman near the benches spoke next. "My father fought in the same war," she said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The tension in the air began to lift, replaced by murmurs of agreement. A young cashier who had been walking by stopped and called out, "Thank you. she said, her voice breaking the moment's quiet. "I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully." The elderly woman, visibly flustered, looked around. She searched for an ally, but there was no one. No one came to her side. She didn't apologize. She simply grabbed her purse tighter and stood up, her face pale as she walked slowly toward the exit, her steps heavy. As she walked away, the park slowly returned to its previous rhythm, though a subtle shift remained. People resumed walking, talking, and playing, but something had changed in the air. Miguel remained where he stood for a while, his thoughts quiet as he looked out over the park. The crowd dispersed, but a new awareness seemed to linger. Later that evening, as Miguel sat at the kitchen table with his father, the old man nodded slowly, his hands resting on the table. "You did the right thing, son," his father said softly, his voice full of pride. "Not just for yourself, but for all of us. You gave her the truth. Maybe it will make her think, and maybe it won't. But you stood your ground." Miguel nodded quietly, his thoughts still swirling. He had stood firm, but the moment wasn't about winning. It was about confronting ignorance, about challenging hate with a voice that could not be ignored. Across town, the elderly woman sat in her living room, staring blankly at the TV. The words she had spoken earlier replayed in her mind, but something had changed. There was a flicker of doubt. Maybe, just maybe, Miguel had been right. Maybe the world wasn't as simple as she had believed. Miguel never sought recognition for what had happened that day. He didn't want a medal. He didn't want a headline. He simply went on with his life quietly, knowing that in that moment he had done more than just defend himself. He had sparked something in the community, a conversation that would not be easily forgotten. And for the first time in a long time, Miguel believed that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. The story shared above is a work of fiction and not based on real events or real individuals. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended to explore themes of social issues, personal courage, and the power of standing up against prejudice, but it should not be interpreted as a factual account.